So I really love investigating Jesus, and I hope you do as well, because Jesus is the most influential person who ever lived, and there's something that we can all learn from him. You see, Jesus, in his message and what he came to do, it's not about advice, it's about news. It's about really good news. So I want to help you make an informed decision about it, because I think this could be the most important decision that you make in your entire life. And so now we're going to turn the corner after our most recent episodes and really focus on the claims about Jesus. Now, among the gospel accounts, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, namely, that are included in the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark is the shortest, and it was very likely the first written, so that's where I want to begin. But before we get too far into it, who is Mark? And how do we know that Mark wrote Mark? Let's investigate. Okay, let's start with the question about how do we know that Mark wrote Mark, and then we'll get to who actually is Mark. So one of the reasons that we can have so much confidence that Mark actually wrote the Gospel of Mark is because the early church agreed that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. So Mark himself as a person is referenced by several of the New Testament writers, and I'm going to read a couple of those, just a few of those references here in just a second. But I want to point out that there's at least an assumption by the writers of the New Testament who reference Mark. There's an assumption that their readers know who he is. So he must have at least been an influential person in the early church. Not only did the New Testament writers reference Mark as an influential person, but not long after many of the New Testament documents were written, there were some other church leaders who referenced them in their writings. One is named Papias, the other is Irenaeus. I'm just going to read what each one of them wrote about him. And Papias was born somewhere around 60 to 70 AD, so just not long after all these events had transpired. And he became a church leader known as the Bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, which is now modern Turkey. And this is what he wrote about Mark. He said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, that is the Apostle Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. It's pretty interesting. Also, Irenaeus of Smyrna in Asia Minor, and a student of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, that is the Apostle John, or John the disciple of Jesus, who wrote several of the books in the New Testament. Interestingly, Irenaeus also, he moved to Rome and studied under Justin Martyr. Irenaeus wrote, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. So really interesting. So not only is Mark referenced in the New Testament several times, he's also referenced by a few of the church leaders, like right at the turn of the first century and into the second century. And so for the first 3 centuries, as the canon of the New Testament is being compiled, we talked about that in a recent episode, there really was no confusion among the early church about who wrote the Gospel of Mark. It was Mark, right? That they all agreed with that. So I hope you find that helpful, but per those who knew him and referenced him, who was this guy? Who was Mark? Well, it's interesting because Mark had a backstory with Jesus' apostles. It wasn't necessarily a pretty backstory, but it had a really redeeming ending in a sense. So Mark in the New Testament is referenced by 2 names. He's referenced as John and also as Mark, or as John Mark. And Mark's proximity to the early church and to the apostles was very, very, very close. In fact, there's a story in the book of Acts written by Luke, who had investigated Jesus' life and ministry and also the significant events of the early church, described a time when the Apostle Peter had been imprisoned, and it was a miraculous divine intervention of his freedom from prison. And he comes out, he thinks he's dreaming, and in Acts chapter 12, It says, when it dawned on him that he wasn't dreaming or having a vision, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying specifically for him. Later in Acts, as the early church, the Jesus movement is developing, we know the Apostle Paul, who originally stepped onto the pages of history as Saul of Tarsus, had been an enemy of the church and now was becoming quite a leader in sharing this news about Jesus. Paul had teamed up with a guy named Barnabas, and they had been spreading the gospel. Well, there came between them a sharp disagreement about Mark specifically. This comes from Acts chapter 15, 37 through 40. Paul and Barnabas were about to set off on another journey, and Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he, that is Mark, had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement, that is Paul and Barnabas did, that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. It's pretty interesting. So something had transpired on a mission trip of Paul and Barnabas and Mark had, for some reason, gotten scared, had gotten bored, something had happened, and he had deserted Paul and Barnabas. So it's understandable that Paul didn't want to bring him. But we learned something else about the relationship between Barnabas and Mark here in just a second that's kind of interesting. You see, after this disagreement, some time has gone by, and Paul himself changed his perspective about Mark. And he wrote a couple letters showing how he actually valued Mark greatly and wanted him to be part of his ministry team again. One is in a letter that we call Colossians. This comes from Colossians 4, verse 10. Paul writes, "My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas." Interesting. So it can kind of understand a little bit better why Barnabas wanted to take Mark. It's kind of a family thing. And Paul continues, "You have received instructions about him, about Mark. If he comes to you, welcome him." So Paul at one point did not want Mark part of his team, and now he's saying to a church he's writing to, hey, if Mark comes to you, welcome him. He's a brother. Moreover, Paul writes to Timothy. This is in a second letter that he writes to him, and he says to Timothy, "Do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. So get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry." So you can see how Paul has changed his perspective on Mark, meaning Mark has done something to re-earn Paul's trust that he is worthy of being part of this ministry team. Let me just read one more because I think this is helpful. And I'm not meaning for this to be exhaustive, but Peter, the Apostle Peter, also had a very close relationship with Mark. Not only did we see that in some of the quotes that I just read just a minute ago, but Peter himself, in a letter that he writes the church, this is from 1 Peter 5:13, says, "She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends her greetings, as does my son Mark. Greet one another with a kiss of love." So we see Peter referencing Mark as his son. And some might say, well, how do we know it's not his biological son? Well, there's really no evidence of Peter having a biological son named Mark, but there's significant evidence of Peter having a disciple who he was closely related to and was closely related in the early church named Mark. So again, I'm trying to show you that there's significant evidence about Mark not only writing Mark, but him having a significant role to play in the early church. And Mark's story it's messy. It's kind of messy, but eventually, even though at one point he had deserted Paul and Barnabas, he became bold in the end in writing about Jesus' life. His mentor, Mark's mentor, Peter, was eventually crucified. and yet Mark wrote this account and it circulated all throughout all throughout the early church. So pretty interesting stuff. But Mark had a very simple objective and approach. And I think this is really helpful in getting to know who he is just from the very first line. So when Mark writes his account, is not much of it is really about Jesus' private life. The Gospel of Mark is all about Jesus' ministry, his death, and his resurrection. And Mark's main objective is right up front. It's the only time that you really get to hear what Mark believes. The rest of it is just accounts of other people's experiences and what they believe. But right up front, the Gospel of Mark writing, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This is almost like the newspaper headline, right? This is the headline, hey, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And you go to that headline and now you want to read the article. That's the way this is written. Now, I know that Papias, in his quote that I read a minute ago, he said that that Mark's account was not orderly, was not written in order. Luke also, at the beginning of his account, says that several of the accounts that were written were not orderly, meaning they're not written in chronological order. They had a different purpose. But Mark's account is not random. And I don't believe it was a criticism of Papias or Luke to say of Mark's account that it was not orderly. I think they're just saying it's not chronological, but it's also not random. You can see that Mark's account is actually outlined into 3 different parts, and we'll get to each of those 3 parts. The first part goes from chapter 1 through about the middle of chapter 8, and it's all about who is Jesus. So that's going to be our focus over the next several episodes. We're not going to rush through this. We're going to take some time. But I also wanted to point out that not only is it not random based on the outline, but the literary style that Mark uses. He uses what's called a chiasmus. It's where certain parts, certain lines in what he's writing correspond to one another. It follows a pattern of A, B, C, B, A. And I'll explain that more as we go through because it's helpful, because Mark is trying to draw our attention to certain things, and he's inviting us to reflect on those. But Mark, though he lays out this big headline that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, that's the big claim, Mark didn't expect his readers to take his word for it. In fact, Mark invites people to investigate the claim that he's making. He lays out what I call a trail of testimonies, one testimony after another that supports the claim that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And I'll say this, if there had been a material discrepancy in anything that Mark had written, the early church would have known about it, and it would have faded like several of the other accounts did as well. I think that will become really clear in this study. So here's the point. Let me just wrap up with this. Mark was close to the apostles, namely Peter. While he had a messy backstory, he eventually risked his own life, putting down into words the life and ministry, death and resurrection of Jesus. He risked his own life to do that because he believed this wasn't good advice. It was good news, very good news that everyone should know. So I want to invite you to join me in investigating Mark's claim of Jesus being the Messiah, the Son of God. And if you already believe that, I hope this can help you reflect on it, maybe in a new way, maybe put more of your trust, maybe obey Jesus even more fully as your King, and also help you be able to have intelligent conversations with other people about Jesus, the New Testament, and specifically the Gospel of Mark. And if you're unsure about that claim of Jesus being the Messiah and the Son of God, again, my whole reason for doing all this is to help you make an informed decision. Now, surprisingly, Mark's story doesn't begin with Jesus. It actually begins with John and his testimony about Jesus. So we're going to pick up there in the next episode. Hope you'll click on it, and I'll see you there.